years after the last one. First though tonight, the never-ending saga of Italian politics and its almost eternal involvement with organised crime and corruption. In other words, the Mafia. Last week, the flamboyant media tycoon who was briefly Prime Minister of Italy, Silvio Berlusconi, was found guilty of bribing the country's tax inspectors. But Berlusconi won't be going to jail straight away. He's free while his appeal against the court ruling is being heard. But when the leader of the opposition is a convicted criminal, it leaves Italy's claim to have cleaned up its act looking a bit hollow, especially when that leader is also the owner of 3 television stations conducting a vitriolic campaign against the country's courts and magistrates. All this, of course, is manna from heaven for the old Sicilian mafia, the Cosa Nostra. After their vicious murder of Italy's most respected mafia hunter, Judge Giovanni Falcone, 6 years ago, there was a massive backlash against the mafia. But now, as Jonathan Holmes reports from Palermo, the mafia may be on the way back.
In one of the great Baroque churches that are the glory of Palermo, a memorial mass is held each year in honor of Judge Giovanni Falcone. For decades, church and state and Cosa Nostra formed an unholy trinity that ruled over Sicily. With the murder 6 years ago of its most celebrated enemy, the Mafia declared war on the state, and the state hit back. But Falcone's successors fear that the public's enthusiasm for the anti-mafia struggle is waning.
Molte donne si sono associate contro. Io credo che oggi purtroppo la situazione sia molto cambiata e che le coscienze si stiano di nuovo assopendo.
Meanwhile, they say, the state and the mafia may be quietly making peace once more. Every afternoon, as the boats return to the fishing port of Castellammare del Golfo, a man with a black Mercedes is waiting for them. He's the owner, it seems, and he's not short of a bob or two. But a few boxes of prawns, the whole day's catch from 2 trawlers, seem unlikely to be his only source of income. It was back in the 1950s that fishing boats from Sicily started scooping up packets of morphine base dropped by Turkish freighters. It was refined into heroin and smuggled on to America. The Sicilian and American mafias had done a deal. In the next 30 years, it was to make the Sicilians unimaginably rich. And with the money came greed. During the 1980s, this beautiful island was racked by an extraordinary undeclared civil war as the mafia families fought to control the new wealth. In 10 years, there were an estimated 10,000 murders. That's 3 times as many violent deaths as occurred in Northern Ireland during the whole 30 years of the Troubles there. Among the victims were politicians and policemen, magistrates and priests, but by far the majority were ordinary mafiosi soldiers who'd crossed their bosses or whose bosses had been double-crossed by somebody still more powerful. For 10 years, the city of Palermo became a killing field. There were secret torture chambers in the dockside tenement buildings, and the seabed of the Gulf filled up with bones. Michela Buscema's brothers were among the humblest victims. They weren't heroin dealers or thugs, just out-of-work kids trying to make a living. But in this seedy alleyway, the mafia killed them anyway.
Prima l'hanno torturati, poi l'hanno strangolati, dovevano scioglierli nell'acido, ma siccome non era di qualità buona, hanno deciso di buttarli a mare. Ecco, qui fino a poco tempo fa era aperto e si vedeva meglio la camera della morte.
The gruesome punishment that took place here was out of all proportion to the crime. The brothers had been selling smuggled cigarettes without permission from the local mafia boss.
Perché nessuno li ricorda, perché non erano servitori dello Stato, erano soltanto due ragazzi qualunque.
There's a simple rule covering such events in Sicily. Hear nothing, see nothing, and above all, say nothing. But Michela Buscema gave evidence in court against her brother's killers and paid the inevitable price. Her husband's bar in Palermo was bombed, then ostracized. They had to sell up and move out of town.
Quando devi partorire? Quanto ci vuole?
Even Michela's own parents turned against her.
Mi hanno attaccato attraverso i giornali dicendo che ero pazza, eccetera, e tante altre cose, lasciandomi sola a me con mio marito e i miei figli in mano della mafia. Anzi, lei, alla mia insistenza, mia madre mi augurò che mi uccidessero i miei figli affinché provassi lo stesso dolore, come se io non credevo al dolore che provava lei.
Almost single-handedly in the early 80s, two men fought to strip off the blanket of silence that covered Sicily. Investigating magistrates Giovanni Falconi and Paolo Borsellino. In 1985, after years of work, in a famous mass trial in Palermo, they prosecuted hundreds of mafiosi. The mafiosi were openly contemptuous of the court. The worst most of them faced, or so they thought, was a few years in prison. But Falconi and Borsellino had signed their own death warrants, and they knew it. In May 1992, on the freeway from Palermo airport to the city, a massive bomb blast killed Judge Falconi, his wife Francesca, and 3 police bodyguards. At the time, Magistrate Teresa Principato was working with Judge Paolo Borsellino.
Quando gli dicevamo ma che cosa facciamo quando c'era questo momento di smarrimento, lui diceva dobbiamo continuare in nome di tutto quello in cui abbiamo sempre creduto, per cui sono morte queste persone. Sapeva benissimo di dover essere ucciso, sapeva ora che sarebbe toccata a lui.
Sure enough, 3 months later, Borsellino too was dead, killed by another huge bomb placed outside his mother's apartment. It seemed for a moment that the mafia had triumphed utterly. But at Borsellino's funeral, the people of Palermo finally found their voice.
Cioè il momento post-stragi era un momento di fortissima mobilitazione civile, fortissima, che ha coinvolto direi quasi un'intera città. Sembravano avere trovato un comune senso di rifiuto, di rigetto.
The revolution spread even to the secret hill towns where the mafia had ruled for decades. In 1993, the town of San Giuseppe Jato elected an anti-mafia mayor. What's more, it re-elected Maria Maniscalco as recently as December last year.
Sicuramente la mafia è indebolita, ma non per questi 4 anni di amministrazione. È indebolita in generale perché intanto non ha più il consenso popolare che aveva prima.
Was there one particular crime that helped to turn public opinion around in San Giuseppe?
Sia l'uccisione di Falcone e Borsellino, il modo così efferato con cui sono stati uccisi questi magistrati, è stato, diciamo, ha molto scosso la gente, però qui a livello locale la gente è rimasta molto impressionata per la tragica fine del piccolo Di Matteo.
To find out about the little Di Matteo boy, we followed San Giuseppe's lone policeman, Constable Orabello, through the town and out into the vineyards and early summer hayfields. We had to cover the last few hundred meters on foot.
And it was just right in the bottom of the house here, wasn't it? Yeah, there is a...
In 1994, this shabby, secluded little house was rented by one Giovanni Brusca, the nephew of the town's mafia boss.
Ecco, vedi, vieni, la prima aperta.
Brusca was the man who set off the bomb that killed Judge Falcone. But the house was the scene of a darker and more secret crime. When one of Brusca's fellow assassins, a man called Santino Di Matteo, was arrested, Brusca was determined to stop him from talking. So he kidnapped Di Matteo's 11-year-old son and hid him here in this house. A complex hydraulic system raised and lowered the ground floor. Beneath it was a pitch-dark dungeon where young Giuseppe was kept prisoner for 2 years. Giovanni Brusca reportedly got the idea from the comic books he loved to read.
Charming.
But even though he knew that his son was a captive of the Brusca family, Santino Di Matteo didn't stop talking. Eventually, he told the authorities that it was Giovanni Brusca who'd actually pushed the plunger on the bomb that had killed Judge Falcone. When Brusca heard of this ultimate betrayal, he was furious and he ordered the young boy killed. His killers were later captured, and they told the authorities that they'd strangled him and, as was customary, put his body in a bath of acid. The boy didn't put up much resistance, they said. After all, he'd been in a hole for 2 years, and he didn't have many muscles left. That was in 1996. A few months ago, Giovanni Brusca and his equally vicious brother were finally captured. It was an event stage-managed by the police for maximum publicity. But the hatred that the press and the public felt for the Bruscas was genuine enough. The Bruscas were just 2 of dozens of mafia bosses arrested in the past 5 years by triumphant police undercover squads. The public revolt forced the Italian state for the first time to lend its full support to the prosecutors and police of Sicily. And they got results. You can drive around Sicily today with no fear that you'll stumble on a bloody corpse by the roadside. But less dramatic, more insidious crimes are everywhere. Across the valley from San Giuseppe Jato, a small construction firm has been given the contract to repair a mountain road. The council accepted the lowest tender, but the firm is from out of town and obviously hasn't bought the right protection. 2 nights ago, 2 of the contractor's excavators were deliberately set on fire. Ask questions, and all you'll get is the traditional Sicilian answer.
And do you know who did it or why they did it?
No, noi non sappiamo nulla di niente. L'abbiamo lasciato bene, l'abbiamo trovato così.
But the mayor of San Giuseppe Jato has no doubt at all who's responsible.
Queste intimidazioni contro le imprese non sono mai cessate. Purtroppo questo ci dice che ancora c'è una mafia forte, che non è sconfitta e che non cede. Non cede nel senso che rimane a controllare le attività illecite come se niente fosse cambiato, o quasi.
But that's not the way most people see it in Palermo.
A dove la vera? Approfittate, non è mezzo chilo, 1 chilo, 2.000. Tutto regalato oggi, tutto regalato oggi!
It's the 6th anniversary of Giovanni Falcone's death. But the sun is shining, the markets are open, the killings have stopped, and most people don't want to think about the mafia anymore. There are, of course, some who do. Surrounded by his bodyguards, the head of the anti-mafia pool of magistrates, Judge Caselli, leads his entire team out from the Palace of Justice to meet his supporters. For days, posters and TV ads have been calling on Palermitans to rally in support of the anti-mafia pool.
Innanzitutto un grazie veramente dal profondo del cuore. Numerosi, compatti, entusiasti, determinati.
Enthusiastic they may be, but numerous they're not. 6 years ago, a whole city took to the streets to defy the mafia. Today, only a few hundred have turned out. Teresa Principato knows all too well what's happening.
Questa è purtroppo una città che dimentica, un rigetto di quella che viene ormai chiamata come una cultura dell'emergenza. Evidentemente è molto comodo a molti ritenere che la mafia sia finita.
But as one of the elite team of mafia prosecutors, Principato is convinced that Cosa Nostra has simply changed its tactics.
Dopo avere attaccato anche quest'ala militare di Cosa Nostra, quella che è invece l'ala decisionista che tenta di ricompattare Cosa Nostra con il potere politico, sociale, ad ogni livello. Credo che questo silenzio dovuto al ritorno di questa mentalità molto più pericolosa perché molto più subdola, più serpeggiante.
It's provincial election time in Palermo and the politicians are out on the hustings. The anti-mafia movement is rooting for this man, the squeaky clean candidate of the centre-left. But it's a sign of how times have changed, that the polls are pointing to victory for the right-wing candidate, Francesco Mozzotto. He's been president of the province of Palermo before, but he was forced to stand down 2 years ago, accused by the magistrates of colluding with the mafia. Mozzotto is a criminal lawyer who's defended many a mafia boss in his time and got them acquitted. Now he's been acquitted himself, although his brother is serving 5 years for collusion. His party, Forza Italia, has been campaigning vigorously, not against the mafia, but against the emergency powers that Italian magistrates use to fight it.
Diciamo, quando si opera in situazione di emergenza la possibilità che accadano errori giudiziari è maggiore. Noi speriamo che questo fenomeno della mafia venga sradicato e quindi la possibilità che tanti innocenti possano subire ingiustamente delle conseguenze di ordine giudiziario.
No, io non voglio assolutamente commentare le dichiarazioni di un Mozzotto. Quello che invece mi premerebbe rilevare è questo. Questi magistrati antimafia contro i quali oggi vengono lanciati gli strali di una buona parte dei rappresentanti di certi partiti politici, che vedono in questi magistrati in prima linea i nemici. Questo è veramente intollerabile, è vero che è troppo duro.
Io l'ho sentito lì.
On the day after the election, as the votes are counted, the big boys from the national networks are in town.
Sì, buongiorno dall'assessorato agli enti locali.
If the Forza Italia candidate gets up, despite the allegations that are still hanging over him, it will be a national story, especially for the television networks owned by his leader, Silvio Berlusconi. But they won't be drawing the same conclusions as Mayor Maria Maniscalco.
Però non c'è dubbio che se dovesse vincere Mozzotto sarebbe un segnale molto molto negativo, perché vuol dire che ancora la gente subisce condizionamenti e che non c'è molta volontà di cambiare.
But Mayor Maniscalco was to be disappointed. Francesco Musotto and Forza Italia won convincingly. At his victory press conference, the new president-elect of the province of Palermo made it clear, politely but firmly, that he expected the magistrates to lay off.
Io però ho grande rispetto per la magistratura e per la procura, però vorrei che altro grande rispetto sia dato nei confronti della politica e di chi è eletto dalla gente. Credo che il giudizio popolare, il giudizio democratico sia il primo giudizio che deve essere ritenuto importante.
For a few brief years, the people, the politicians, the police and the magistrates of Palermo were united against the mafia. But tonight, as the anti-mafia elite of the city gather to honor the memory of Giovanni Falcone, that sense of unity has gone. The police and the Carabinieri and the Guardia di Finanza are out in force. So are the tough young plainclothes men with guns, and the tough young women too. But for the frontline magistrates of the anti-mafia pool, the guns and bombs of the mafia hitmen are no longer the threat they fear. The enemy, as he has been so often in the past, is back within the gates.
Il momento in cui i magistrati vengono osteggiati, vengono considerati dei nemici, vengono lasciati soli, e questo è un momento molto simile a quelli che pure lui ha vissuto. Veramente io ho visto Giovanni Falcone distrutto da questa presa di posizione.
La mafia pone emergenze, ma è una costante e va combattuta con forza, con efficienza.
The mafia is patient and persistent. It knows how to survive setbacks and keep coming back. But so do its opponents. Not all of those who rebelled 6 years ago have retreated into apathy. Like Giovanni Falcone himself, they're in it for the long haul.
Forse un amore per la propria terra che ti impone di continuare per evitare che tutto ricada ancora una volta al solito sotto quella oppressione, sotto quella cappa silenziosa ma uniforme, totale.
Odio però la violenza, la sopraffazione, l'ingiustizia. E penso che sconfiggere la mafia sia necessario per lo sviluppo di questi territori e per liberare le persone.
Cioè, siamo andati indietro noi ora, in questi tempi siamo andati indietro nella lotta alla mafia. E siamo ritornati indietro di quando c'era Falcone. Però io sono sempre un po' ottimista. Penso che un giorno riusciremo a vincere la mafia. Sì. Se no non avrebbe senso noi continuare questa lotta.
Jonathan Holmes there in Sicily.